And you'll notice that should remind you a little bit of an atom, because an atom is a positively charged proton with a negatively charged electron orbiting it. Well, this is just like that in the sense that you have a negatively charged thing orbiting a positively charged thing, except it's the positively charged thing is a more funny kind of thing, right? Because it's a missing electron. But the combination acts like a little mini atom, and it can move around. So it's a particle of some sort, and that particle is called an exciton, because what's really happened is that you had an electron that was sitting in that atom in the middle there, and you knocked it off, and now it's that red guy sort of waiting to fall back into the hole, but temporarily orbiting it. But it acts like a particle called an exciton. That is, the whole combined thing acts like a particle. So you can make materials that have excitons in them, and you can make a gas of excitons and so on. It's very exciting. Sorry, I couldn't resist that. Okay, so then after you spend 10 years doing experiments with excitons, you say like, hey, well, we could do even weirder things. So like this, you could take that thin gray sheet in the middle there is some kind of crystal that is where you can easily create excitons. So you see there's like a hole and an electron there attracted to each other. The spiral rubber band there is just metaphorical, right? They're just attracting each other, and together they form an exciton. But what we're doing now is we're putting it between two mirrors. So the blue guys are mirrors. Light can bounce back and forth between the two mirrors, and the light always interacts with electrically charged things. So the light will push the electron around, and it will push the hole around, or pull on it. And so the light will interact with the exciton. But remember, light is made of particles too. So the light is photons. So what you get here is a situation where you have a bunch of photons bouncing it back and forth between the mirror, but they're interacting very strongly with these excitons. And it turns out that they can sort of blend with each other. The photons can keep making the exciton excited, and the exciton can keep making the photon excited. And that the whole combination of them is a thing in itself. And that thing can move around. And that combined thing has a name too. It's another kind of particle. It's called a polariton. So people learned, hey, we can make more complicated particles, quasi-particles called polaritons. Remember, none of these are fundamental particles. These are just ways that things can wiggle that nonetheless act like particles in the sense that they can move around, they can have a mass, they can have energy, they can have all the things that other kind of particles can have. So, in fact, people have been doing amazing stuff with polaritons. So a polariton, you should really think of it as some kind of weird new particle that's a blend of matter, namely the exciton, and light, namely the photon. So in a lot of ways, they act like photons. They have no electric charge, but they're different because they move much slower than light. They actually have they have mass, unlike photons, and they move much slower than light. And they can bump into each other and sort of slow each other down and stuff, so they can even form a liquid. So these are some photographs of a flow of polaritons around the little obstacle, which is that sort of black thing near the top here. And depending on how you set it up, you could make this fluid have no viscosity. It could be a superfluid, so it just flows right around the obstacle, or you could have it that it leaves a trail of ripples, like when a boat's going through an ocean, it leaves a wake, and it can do it in various ways. So basically, this is like as close as you can come to making liquid light. The idea is, could I make a liquid out of light? Well, no, because photons are massless and they're just zipping along at the speed of light. But if you slow them down by letting them interact with matter a bit and form a sort of bigger blobby thing called a polariton, then you can do all this stuff, like make a liquid. So these are just a few of the many things that people are doing. This field is called condensed matter physics, meaning that you're studying liquids and solids, and you can craft liquids and solids to have all sorts of different behaviors, and you can make all sorts of kinds of liquids and all sorts of stuff. So there's lots going on, but you have to realize that physics doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? There's history going on. And the 21st century has a lot of big challenges. In particular, I want to focus on one. We've entered a new epoch. The Holocene was the geological epoch that we were in, that we called the present. What a stupid name, right? I mean, it's always the present, right? But anyway, we were very self-centered back then, right? But now we're not in the present anymore. That was then. Now we're in the Anthropocene. It's defined to be the geological epoch when the biosphere is rapidly changing due to human activities. Human population shot up in large part due to mechanized agriculture, and all sorts of consequences are occurring. Of course, you hear about global warming a lot, and that's a real important thing. It's an incredibly huge challenge of this century. We've completely left the ice age cycles that had been going on actually for millions of years, although this just goes 400,000 years back. This is the concentration of carbon dioxide, which tracks pretty well with temperature, and we just went boing and shot up. And in fact, we're shooting up so fast that I can look at this graph and I can see that this graph is about 15 years old, because actually now we're like up about there. So we're in this situation where the Earth's climate is changing faster than it's changed, as far as I know, maybe forever, although it's very hard to look back in fine-grained detail in geological records, but it's really amazing. And so the temperature of the Earth, which was low in the ice age, last ice age, reached a peak about 6,000 years ago, and then was beginning to cool down. We would have eventually had another big ice age, but then, bing, due to the increased carbon dioxide concentration, the temperature is shooting straight up in this geological time scale graph. So between high school for me and now, the amount of Arctic sea ice has gone down to 1/3 of what it was. So the whole Arctic is different now. That produces different weather patterns. As you know, big fires in Canada, just like last week. But I want to say that global warming is just the tip of the iceberg. If you thought that was fun, we were completely dominating the biosphere now. About 1/4 of all the chemical energy that's sunlight captured by plants is now being used by humans. The amount of biomass of farmed mammals is about 14 times that of wild mammals. The amount of biomass of farmed birds is about 2.5 times that of wild birds. So wilderness is sort of a small thing now. The population of large ocean fish have declined 90% since 1950. The rate of species going extinct, which is very hard to estimate, is somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times the usual rate. We now take more nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it into nitrates for the purpose of making fertilizer than all the natural processes that do that. And about 8 or 9 times as much phosphorus, a vital material for fertilizers, is flowing into oceans than the natural background rate, because we sprinkle the fertilizer all over the place and just let it wash into the Mississippi and other rivers and contaminate the oceans and create dead zones. So everything is dramatically changing. So we really need new ideas to adapt to this world. We've been pretending that the Earth is essentially infinite and that we're just these little things whose effect is negligible, and that we might as well just keep growing, making everything more happier and happier. But by acting that way, we reach the point where that's not true anymore. Now the Earth is not essentially infinite. Our effect on the biosphere is massive, and exponential growth of many kinds of things can no longer continue. So we have to really rethink our whole civilization, and we have to do it pretty fast, or we're running into various walls as we speak. So one thing we need to do is take some lessons from nature, and I don't really mean go back to nature. I mean learn from nature. So we have this simple picture that we often imagine, that like there are resources that we get somehow, mine them or something. We produce stuff, we make a product, and then we use the product. Well, that's very nice, except it's not really like that. Because really what's going on, right, is that there's waste going out when we produce, and there's waste going out after we consume. And by neglecting that, we're just like living in a fantasy world, which can't go on forever. But the interesting thing is that in nature, it doesn't work that way. There's not piles of waste sitting around like, oh, these animals have been like eating stuff and they just like dump their trash in the woods. Well, they do dump their trash in the woods in their own way, right? But that trash is just what something else needs to eat. So what's waste for us is resources in there, in the natural world. And we need to realize that's just that's the sustainable way to have an ecosystem. So that's seems like a good lesson, but it's actually very complex because the flows of matter and energy are very complex. There are many complex cycles. And now that we're in charge of the whole Earth, we need to understand those things and work with them instead of trying to fight against them. So global warming is just one of the things that we're going to have to learn how to deal with. So there are climate models, and those use a huge amount of physics. They're in fact the most complex scientific computations that humans have tried, and they involve a lot of fluid dynamics, all sorts of physics, also a lot of biology, a lot of other things. One of the main sources of inaccuracy of climate models is that we don't understand clouds very well, and clouds are, until recently, too small to fit into the grid that we use in these simplified models. So people don't know for sure whether there are going to be more clouds or less clouds as it gets hotter. I mean, we're beginning to understand that, but it's incredibly important. And that's an aspect of physics that we need to understand. Luckily, nature has lots to teach us. For example, there are these minerals here called perovskites, which if you examine them at the atomic scale have these beautiful atomic patterns. And they turn out to be really great for doing all sorts of interactions between electrons and photons. And so people are starting to make solar cells out of perovskites that are possibly competitive with the current silicon solar cells that also use ideas from quantum mechanics. But this is something that was found by examining what nature can do. Or another example, there are actually millions of examples, but I just like this one. So if you look at a butterfly, a lot of butterflies, not all, will have a luminescent kind of wings, sort of iridescent kind of wings. This is a particular species that does. And it turns out that stuff is what's called a photonic crystal. It's a kind of crystalline pattern that is very small, but spaced about the wavelength of the light, and it makes for these colors. So there's not a blue dye on this, or blue-green dye on this butterfly. It's a crystal. And this particular one has a crystal that's in the shape of a pattern that's roughly this sort of shape here. This is a shape that was invented by a mathematician working for NASA called a gyroid. And, well, I shouldn't say it was invented by the mathematician because the butterfly might have different ideas about this. But the mathematician independently invented this shape and was wanting to use it as like a nice, very sturdy material for spacecraft, which didn't really get used that way. But we've discovered that the material in this butterfly wings is arranged in this same gyroid pattern. And so now we are beginning to understand that, and many other materials in nature are exquisitely patterned, and we are beginning to learn how to make them. But you'll notice the difference. If we just go ahead and try to make this kind of material, we'd use a big lab with a bunch of chemicals and it'd be like a whole bunch of waste, and we'd have to be running up the electric bill trying to make this stuff. Whereas this butterfly, what does it do? How does it make it? It just flies around. It just flies around and eats nectar out of flowers, and then it somehow manufactures this material and it reproduces itself. So our technology is incredibly crude compared to the technologies of nature. And I think we have to catch up a little bit and learn physics and learn a lot from nature. And so I hope we do that in this century to come. Okay, thanks.